The night sky was clear and filled with stars, unusually bright over the dense, remote forest where David often conducted his botanical research. As he walked through the woods, checking his specimen traps and taking notes, a bright streak suddenly cut through the sky, crashing somewhere nearby with a thunderous roar. Curiosity piqued, he grabbed his flashlight and headed towards the impact site. Pushing through the thick underbrush, David reached a small clearing. There, embedded in the earth, lay a bizarre, metallic object unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was clearly a spacecraft, small and sleek, still hissing and steaming from the impact. David approached cautiously, circling the craft, noting its strange symbols and seamless joints. As he neared the front of the ship, a hatch slowly opened with a soft whoosh. Inside, he glimpsed movement. A figure emerged, stumbling, clearly injured. The alien was humanoid, her skin a shimmering silver that caught the moonlight, her eyes wide and luminous. She looked around, panic evident in her gaze, before collapsing to the ground. David rushed to her side, his initial shock overridden by his instinct to help. He checked for injuries, noting some minor cuts and a possible sprain. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help," he said gently, though he wasn't sure she could understand him. The alien stared at him, her breathing heavy. She spoke, her voice musical but the language unrecognizable. Seeing her distress, David tried to reassure her. "I don't understand what you're saying, but I can help you." She seemed to calm slightly, watching him with an intense curiosity. After a moment, she touched a device at her throat and then tried speaking again. This time, her words came out in awkward but understandable English. "Help. I need shelter. Of course, you can come with me. I have a camp not far from here." David helped her to her feet, supporting her as they walked slowly back through the forest. As they made their way to his camp, David tried to make sense of the situation. "My name is David. What's yours?" "Zara," she replied, her voice gaining some strength. "That's a nice name," David smiled, trying to keep the atmosphere light. "Welcome to Earth, Zara." Zara looked around with a mix of awe and fear. "Earth. David, I was a princess on Lyriana. I had to escape. There was no choice." David nodded, processing this revelation. "Well, your secret's safe with me. Let's focus on getting you fixed up and figuring out your next steps tomorrow." They reached his camp, a small, sturdy cabin with solar panels on the roof and various botanical equipment scattered around. Inside, David helped Zara onto a couch, then went to fetch his first aid kit. As he treated her cuts, Zara watched every move closely. "You are kind, David. Not like the stories told of humans." David chuckled. "I can assure you, we're not all that bad. Now, try to rest. We'll figure out everything else when the sun comes up." Zara settled back, her eyes heavy but her voice firm. "Human, let me be your pet," she said, using the words without fully understanding their connotations on Earth. David paused, a smile playing on his lips. "We'll talk about it in the morning, Zara. For now, just try to get some sleep." As he dimmed the lights, leaving the cabin bathed in the soft glow of emergency lamps, David pondered the strange turn his research trip had taken. He was no longer just a botanist. He was now a caretaker for an alien princess. David woke to the smell of charred wood and a faint hum emanating from outside his cabin. For a moment, the events of the previous night seemed like a surreal dream, but as his eyes adjusted to the morning light, the alien figure on his couch came into sharp focus. Zara stirred, her silvery skin glinting in the sunlight streaming through the window. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around, taking in her surroundings with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. When her gaze landed on David, she sat up abruptly, wincing. "Easy," David said, stepping closer. "You're still hurt." "I'll recover," Zara replied, her voice steady, though tinged with exhaustion. She hesitated before adding, "Thank you, David. You saved me." David shrugged, pulling a chair closer to her. "I couldn't just leave you there." "So, Zara, what now? Are you okay to talk about what happened to you? Why you're here?" Zara glanced away, her luminous eyes scanning the modest room. "My ship is damaged beyond repair. I was fleeing, A dangerous situation. My people wanted to control me, force me into a role I refused. David frowned. Sounds rough, but you're safe here for now. I'll help you figure things out. She met his gaze, her expression softening. Why would you help me, a stranger, an alien? Let's just say helping people or beings is what I do, David replied. Plus, I'm a botanist, not exactly the kind of guy to get into intergalactic politics. Botanist? Zara tilted her head. Yeah, I study plants. You know, those green things outside, David said with a chuckle. They're sort of my life's work. Zara nodded, her curiosity growing. We had plants on Lyriana, though I never studied them. My duties didn't allow for such interests. Well, lucky for you. You've landed in the middle of Earth's finest wilderness. I can show you around if you're up for it, David offered. Fresh air might do you some good. Zara hesitated, but then gave a small nod. I'd like that. The two set out, Zara moving cautiously with David's help. The forest was alive with the chatter of birds and the rustle of leaves. David pointed out various plants, explaining their properties and uses. This one here, David said, crouching by a patch of green leaves, is wild mint. It's great for making tea. Smell it. Zara bent down, inhaling deeply. A faint smile appeared on her face. It's pleasant. See? Earth's not so bad, David said, grinning. As they walked further, Zara's steps grew more confident. She occasionally asked questions, her fascination with Earth's flora apparent. David found himself enjoying the exchange, appreciating her keen mind and the way she absorbed every detail. They stopped by a stream, where David knelt to collect water samples for his research. Zara watched him work, her expression thoughtful. You dedicate your time to this, to plants and water? Pretty much, David said, filling a vial. Nature's got everything we need. We just have to understand it. Zara looked down at the flowing water. Your world feels untainted. It's strange but comforting. David glanced at her. Well, it has its flaws, but yeah, it's got its moments. The rest of the day passed in quiet exploration and conversation. Zara began to open up about her life, the burdens of her royal status, and the loneliness she often felt. David listened, offering quiet reassurance, but mostly letting her speak. By the time they returned to the cabin, Zara seemed more at ease, though a shadow of worry lingered in her eyes. David, she said as they settled inside, you could have left me there. Why didn't you? David leaned back in his chair. I guess I saw someone who needed help. It's as simple as that. She regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. I think I was meant to find you. David laughed softly. Well, here's hoping you don't regret it. Let's get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next steps. As Zara settled in for the night, David sat by the window, watching the stars. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he felt a strange certainty that they'd find their way together. The sun was already high when David woke, stretching in his small but tidy cabin. Zara was sitting at the wooden table, her silvery fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on her cup. She was staring intently at the faint steam rising from the coffee David had brewed for her. Not bad, right? David asked as he approached, his tone casual but curious. Zara looked up, startled. It's bitter. David chuckled. Yeah, coffee's an acquired taste. Some people swear by it. You might end up liking it. She tilted her head. It seems to have stimulating properties. My senses feel sharper. That's caffeine for you, David said, grabbing his own cup and sitting down across from her. We'll make a human out of you yet. Her lips curved slightly, a fleeting smile. That may take time. Well, let's start small, David said, leaning back. If you're going to be here a while, we should get you acquainted with Earth. Food, language, some basic cultural stuff. Language? Zara asked, gesturing to the device on her neck. Doesn't this suffice? It works, but trust me, there's something about learning the words yourself. It'll help you fit in better if you ever decide to venture out. Zara studied him for a moment, then nodded. Teach me. David grabbed a notepad and pen from the counter. All right, let's start with something simple. This, he held up the pen, is a pen. Zara's gaze followed his movements. Pin, she repeated, her accent wrapping around the word awkwardly but precisely. Perfect. Now this, he tapped the table, is a table. Table, she echoed, her voice soft but deliberate. They went through several more objects in the room, Zara repeating each word with increasing confidence. Occasionally, her attempts would draw a laugh from David, who corrected her with gentle patience. You're a quick learner, David said, impressed. We'll have you speaking fluently in no time. Zara leaned forward slightly. Your language is fluid but challenging. My tongue must move differently. David smirked. You're doing great, but language is just part of it. Let's try something else, food. He rummaged through the pantry, pulling out items and setting them on the table. This is bread, he said, tearing off a piece and handing it to her. Zara inspected it curiously before taking a small bite. Her expression shifted to one of cautious approval. It's simple but pleasant. David laughed. Wait until you try this. He grabbed a jar of peanut butter, scooping out a small amount with a spoon. Try this. Zara hesitated, but took the spoon. She tasted it, her eyes widening slightly. This is extraordinary. Peanut butter, David said, grinning. A staple on Earth. Their lesson continued, moving from food to gestures and basic human customs. Zara watched him intently, mimicking his actions with growing ease. David found himself admiring her sharp mind and the way she absorbed every detail. As the afternoon wore on, they ventured outside. David showed Zara how to use his tools to collect plant samples, teaching her about Earth's flora as they walked through the forest. Zara, in turn, shared details about Liriana's vegetation, describing glowing flowers that thrived on energy from their sunless skies. David stopped at a particularly vibrant patch of moss. This one's called reindeer moss, he said. It's edible if you're ever in a pinch. Zara knelt beside him, running her fingers over the moss. Your planet is rich in life. It feels alive in a way Liriana never did. David looked at her, surprised. Never thought about it like that. Guess I take it for granted. You shouldn't, Zara said, standing. Your world is a gift. David smiled. Well, now that you're here, I'll try to see it the way you do. They returned to the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. Zara sat by the window, her gaze distant. David, she said softly, do all humans live as you do? In solitude? David scratched the back of his neck. Not all. I guess I like the quiet. But it's not always like this. I visit town sometimes. Maybe I'll take you there when you're ready. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. I'd like to see more. To understand your world. David leaned against the counter, watching her. We'll get there. One step at a time. Zara looked at him, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Thank you for everything. Don't mention it, David said with a grin. Tomorrow's another day. We'll tackle more then. The morning was crisp, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of dew as David and Zara ventured further into the forest. The two had grown more comfortable in each other's company, their conversations flowing naturally. David carried his worn satchel, filled with tools and sample containers, while Zara trailed beside him, her steps now more confident on Earth's uneven terrain. So, tell me, David said, glancing at her. What's the weirdest plant on Liriana? Zara pondered for a moment, her luminous eyes narrowing slightly. There was one we called the Ilorath. It looked harmless, tiny, delicate, with translucent petals, but if you touched it, it would emit a cloud of spores that could paralyze you for hours. David raised an eyebrow. Sounds charming. Makes Earth's poison ivy seem like child's play. Zara smirked, a rare expression for her. Your flora feels kinder, even the ones that sting or bite. Well, Earth has its share of nasty surprises, David replied. He crouched by a clump of bright green moss and motioned for Zara to join him. Take this stuff, for example, stinging nettle. Looks harmless, but touch it the wrong way, and you'll regret it. Zara leaned in, studying the plant with fascination. It stings upon contact? Yep, David said, pulling on a pair of gloves. But the irony is, if you prepare it right, it's edible and full of nutrients. You humans are resourceful, Zara noted, tilting her head. turning pain into sustenance. David shrugged. I guess we make do with what we've got. As they moved on, David handed Zara a small notebook and a pencil. Here, try sketching what we find. It'll help you remember. Zara accepted the tools with interest, holding the pencil awkwardly at first, but soon adjusting to its feel. She began drawing a spindly plant with bright yellow flowers. This is calming, she said softly, her focus unwavering. It's how I started, David said, watching her. Sketching plants, taking notes. It helps you notice the little details. Zara glanced up. You must have been very observant as a child. David chuckled. More like a nerd. Other kids played sports. I played with dirt and leaves. Zara smiled faintly, returning to her sketch. And yet, here you are, thriving in the wilderness. Guess we all find our place eventually, David replied, scanning the trees for another interesting specimen. Their exploration led them to a clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Zara paused, her expression shifting to one of quiet awe. Your forests, they feel alive. As if they're watching. David nodded. They kind of are. Trees communicate, you know, through their roots and chemicals. It's like a hidden network. Zara stared at him, her curiosity evident. A network of life, on a microscopic level. That's remarkable. David grinned. Welcome to Earth. Full of surprises. As they rested near a stream, Zara turned to him, her tone more serious. David, why do you live out here, away from others? He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I guess I like the peace. Cities feel too crowded, too noisy. Out here, I can think, work, just be myself. Zara studied him for a moment. And you are content? David shrugged. Most days. But lately, I don't know. Maybe I've been missing something. Connection, Zara said, her voice quiet. David met her gaze, surprised by the insight. Maybe. What about you? Do you miss Liriana? Zara looked away, her expression guarded. I miss what it could have been, but I don't miss the life I was forced to lead. Here, I feel free. David nodded, letting the silence between them linger. It wasn't uncomfortable, it felt meaningful, as if they were sharing something unspoken. As they began the walk back to the cabin, Zara broke the silence. David, do you trust me? He stopped, turning to face her. Yeah, I do. Do you trust me? Zara hesitated, then nodded. I do. More than I expected to. David smiled. Good. Because we're in this together now. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Together. I like the sound of that. They walked the rest of the way in companionable quiet, the bond between them growing stronger with each step. The fire crackled softly in the small cabin's hearth, filling the room with a comforting warmth. David sat at the table, sorting through plant samples he had collected earlier in the day, while Zara sat across from him, studying a notebook filled with sketches and notes she'd been practicing. Outside, the forest hummed with the faint sounds of nocturnal life. David, Zara began, breaking the quiet. I've been meaning to ask you something. David glanced up from his work. Shoot. She hesitated, her silver fingers tracing the edge of the table. Why do you do it? Spend your days alone, collecting plants, when there's a whole world out there you could explore? David leaned back in his chair, considering her question. I guess it's just what I'm good at. Plants make sense to me. They don't argue. They don't judge. They just grow. Zara tilted her head, studying him. But surely you must feel isolated. David shrugged. Sometimes. But I've always been more comfortable in the quiet. The cities never felt like home to me. She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. I understand the need for quiet. Liriana was loud in its own way, always filled with demands and expectations. Here, the silence feels kind. David smiled faintly. Guess we've both found some peace out here. Zara leaned forward, her voice softening. But peace isn't always enough, is it? David's eyes flicked to hers, the intensity of her gaze catching him off guard. What are you getting at? I mean, she said carefully, don't you ever want more? To share your world with someone who understands it the way you do. David set down the sample he'd been examining. I've thought about it, but it's not exactly easy to find someone who's okay with this kind of life. It's simpler not to think about it. Zara nodded slowly. I've lived my life avoiding connection too. I thought it made me stronger, safer. But now, her voice trailed off, and she looked away. David reached across the table, placing a hand gently on hers. Now what? Her luminous eyes met his, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged. Now, I wonder if I was wrong. David held her gaze, his voice low. You're not alone anymore, Zara. Whatever happens next, you've got me. Her fingers tightened around his, and she gave him a small, tentative smile. I never thought I'd find something like this here. Or someone like you. David chuckled softly. Funny. I was thinking the same thing about you. They sat in silence for a moment, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger. Finally, Zara broke the quiet. David, there's something I haven't told you. About why I had to leave Liriana. He leaned back, giving her space to speak. I'm listening. She hesitated, then began. There was a coup. My own people wanted to use me as a symbol, a puppet to control the populace. I couldn't let that happen, so I fled. But leaving meant abandoning everything I knew, everyone I cared about. David nodded, his expression serious. That must have been tough. But you made the right choice for yourself. I hope so, Zara said quietly. But I still feel untethered. Like I don't belong anywhere. You belong here, David said firmly. At least for now. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Her eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly. David, do you really believe that? That I could belong here? I do, he said, his voice steady. And I'll do whatever it takes to help you feel that way. Zara looked at him for a long moment, then reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. You're different from anyone I've ever known. So are you, David replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The fire crackled softly as the distance between them seemed to vanish. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, the truth of their connection became undeniable. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The evening unfolded in a comfortable rhythm, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls of the cabin. David stood by the small counter, stirring a pot of stew while Zara observed him from the couch, her gaze fixed on his movements. You handle food preparation with precision, she noted, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and admiration. David smirked, glancing over his shoulder. It's just cooking, Zara. Not exactly rocket science. Cooking, she repeated, testing the word. On Liriana, sustenance was synthesized. We didn't interact with it. Like this? Well, here on Earth, we like to get our hands dirty, David said, ladling the stew into 2 bowls. He carried them to the table, setting one in front of Zara. Give it a try. I promise it won't bite. She leaned forward, taking a tentative sip. Her expression shifted from skepticism to surprise. This is rich, flavorful. Welcome to Earth cuisine, David said, grinning. Simple but satisfying. As they ate, their conversation flowed naturally, touching on topics ranging from Earth's culture to Zara's memories of Liriana. David found himself captivated by her stories, the way her voice softened when she spoke of her planet's towering crystal forests or its bioluminescent rivers. Do you miss it? David asked, his tone gentle. Zara paused, her spoon hovering over her bowl. At times. But Liriana was not a place of freedom for me. Here, I feel different. Like I can breathe. David nodded. Sometimes it's not the place but the people that make a home. Zara's eyes met his, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. She set her bowl aside, leaning back in her chair. David, I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About belonging. Yeah? He prompted, leaning forward slightly. I never thought I'd find a connection like this, she admitted. With anyone, let alone someone from a completely different world. David chuckled softly. Life's full of surprises. Zara stood, moving closer to where he sat. You've shown me kindness when you didn't have to. Taught me about your world, your ways. I don't know how to repay you. You don't have to repay me, David said, his voice steady. You being here, that's enough. She reached out, her hand brushing against his. David, I want to know more. About you. About this connection we share. David hesitated, his heart thudding in his chest. I think you already know, Zara. Her luminous eyes searched his, and then, slowly, she leaned in. Their lips met, tentative at first, then growing more certain as they closed the distance between them. David's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. As the kiss deepened, Zara pulled back slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. Is this acceptable on your planet? David laughed softly, brushing a strand of her hair away from her face. More than acceptable, she smiled, her expression unguarded for the first time. Good. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of quiet intimacy. They talked in hushed tones, their hands often finding each other's. Zara's curiosity led her to ask questions about earthly relationships, and David answered with honesty, finding her candidness refreshing. When the fire finally burned low, Zara leaned against David, her head resting on his shoulder. I never thought I'd feel this way, she said softly. Not with anyone. Me neither, David admitted. But I'm glad you're here. As the embers glowed in the hearth, they sat together in the quiet, the weight of their shared journey settling around them like a warm blanket. For the first time in a long while, neither felt alone. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting a golden glow over the forest as David packed a small rucksack. Zara stood nearby, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. So, we're going to this town? She asked, her voice laced with hesitation. David nodded, zipping up the bag. Yeah, I need to pick up some supplies, and I figured it'd be a good chance for you to see more of Earth. It'll help you understand how humans live. Zara shifted uneasily. And what if someone notices I'm not one of you? David smiled reassuringly. We'll keep it simple. You'll stick close to me, and we'll avoid drawing attention. Trust me, Zara. You'll be fine. Her luminous eyes searched his face before she finally nodded. Very well. I'm ready. The two made their way along a dirt trail that eventually led to a gravel road. Zara walked with a quiet grace, her silvery skin hidden beneath a long coat David had found for her. The journey was filled with light conversation as David pointed out landmarks and explained the basics of human interactions in public spaces. When they reached the small town, Zara's gaze darted around, taking in the sights. The streets were lined with modest buildings, and a few locals milled about, chatting or tending to their errands. To Zara, it felt simultaneously chaotic and fascinating. David led her to a general store, holding the door open as they entered. Just stay close, he murmured. Inside, Zara marveled at the shelves stocked with goods, cans, jars, and brightly colored packages. Your people store so much, she said under her breath. It's called convenience, David replied with a grin. He grabbed a basket and began picking out items, Zara trailing behind him. As they approached the counter, the shopkeeper, an older man with a weathered face, greeted them. Morning, David. Haven't seen you in a while. Hey, Joe, David said casually. Just stocking up. This is Zara, a friend visiting from out of town. Joe gave Zara a once-over, his brow furrowing slightly. Out of town. Huh? You're not from around here. Zara froze, but David stepped in smoothly. She's from a pretty remote place. Not much like this little town. Joe grunted, still eyeing Zara. Well, welcome then. Thanks, Zara said, her voice steady despite the tension. Once they left the store, Zara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That man was suspicious. David shrugged. Small towns are like that. New faces stick out. Don't worry, Joe's harmless. They spent the rest of the day walking through the town, Zara growing more comfortable as they visited a small cafe and a park. She even exchanged polite greetings with a few locals, her guarded nature easing slightly. However, as they headed back toward the forest, a group of teenagers on bikes approached. One of them, a lanky boy with a mischievous grin, called out, Hey, is that your girlfriend, David? David rolled his eyes. Knock it off, Jason. Jason smirked, looking Zara up and down. She's got a weird vibe. Where's she from? David stepped forward, his tone firm. "None of your business, Jason. Move along." Jason held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. Chill out, man." As the teenagers rode off, Zara looked at David, her expression unreadable. "Does everyone here question strangers like that?" "Pretty much," David admitted, his voice softening. "They don't mean harm. People are just curious." Zara nodded slowly. "Curiosity. It's not something I'm accustomed to. On Liriana, most people kept their distance from me." "Well, you're not on Liriana anymore," David said gently. "Here, people might ask questions, but that's how they get to know each other." As they walked back into the forest, Zara reached out, taking his hand. "Thank you, David, for showing me this." He gave her hand a light squeeze. "Anytime. You're doing great, Zara. Just take it one step at a time." For the first time, Zara felt a small spark of belonging, even in the face of uncertainty. The early morning light spilled through the cabin windows, illuminating Zara as she stood by the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook. She glanced over at David, who was crouched by the hearth, stoking the fire. "David," she began hesitantly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" He paused, the poker still in his hand, and turned to look at her. "Next? You mean for you? For us?" "For everything," she replied, her luminous eyes meeting his. "I've been learning about your world, but I still feel like an outsider. And yet, the idea of leaving." She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the window. David stood and moved to her side. "You're worried about the future," he said, his tone gentle. "I am," Zara admitted. "I don't want to live in hiding, but I also don't know how to truly exist here." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out together, Zara. You don't have to do this alone." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "You say that so easily." "That's because I mean it," David replied. "We've come this far, haven't we?" Zara nodded slowly, then gestured to the door. "Will you take me back to the town today? I want to try again, to see if I can blend in better." David smiled. "Of course. Let's go." They packed a few things and set off, the forest alive with the sound of birdsong and the rustle of leaves underfoot. As they reached the edge of the town, Zara hesitated. "You'll do fine," David said, his voice steady. "Just follow my lead." The first stop was a small farmer's market bustling with locals. Zara stuck close to David, her movements cautious but deliberate. As they browsed the stalls, she asked questions about the goods, brightly colored fruits, jars of honey, and freshly baked bread. "This is incredible," she said softly. "On Liriana, everything was controlled, uniform. Here, it's alive." David chuckled. "That's Earth for you. Messy, unpredictable, but full of surprises." At one stall, a friendly vendor struck up a conversation with David. Zara listened closely, studying the way they interacted. When the vendor turned to her and asked, "And what about you? New in town?" Zara hesitated but nodded. "Yes," she said carefully. "I'm visiting from far away." The vendor smiled. "Well, welcome. Hope you enjoy your time here." As they moved to the next stall, Zara exhaled deeply. "That wasn't so bad." "See? Told you," David said with a grin. "You're doing great." After the market, they sat at a small cafe, sipping tea and watching the world go by. Zara seemed more at ease, her posture relaxed as she observed the people around her. "David," she said suddenly, her tone serious, "I think I want to stay." "Stay?" he asked, setting down his cup. "Here, on Earth," she clarified. "With you. If you'll have me." David leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Zara, I've wanted that from the moment you landed in that clearing." "Of course I'll have you." A smile spread across her face, genuine and unguarded. "I never thought I'd find this, a place to call home." David reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Home isn't a place, Zara. It's the people you share it with. And for me, that's you." Their fingers intertwined, and for the first time, Zara felt a sense of belonging that was entirely her own. As they walked back to the forest, the path ahead felt brighter, their steps lighter. Together, they had built something unexpected, a life worth living. And this, they both knew, was just the beginning.